Yo ho ho! So today I'd like to recommend you some horror short stories for you to check out during this autumnal season. So the first one I'd like to talk about is Dark Water by Koji Suzuki. So Koji Suzuki is the author who wrote the Ring series, so if you've read that or if you've seen the film adaptations and enjoyed it, this may be something worth checking out for you. All the stories are based around the theme of water, of death, of regret, and there's only one story that doesn't have any supernatural elements, which is called Forest Under the Sea, which was one of my favourites in the collection. It also became a bit notorious because a couple of years ago there was a death that happened in real life that was very similar to the death in the first short story Floating Water, and that's the story that Dark Water, the film, is based off of. So if you're familiar with that, that's kind of creepy in its own right. But this is a really strong collection of short stories, and if you want to be genuinely creeped out a bit, I'd definitely recommend it. The next book is The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. So I only read this quite recently and absolutely fell in love with it. I didn't think it was going to be my cup of tea because I've never really read fairy tale retellings and I didn't know if it was going to be something I'd enjoy, but I ended up really liking it, and I recommend it if you're someone who wants to read something that's kind of spooky but you don't want to get completely and utterly freaked out. I'd regard this as quite a fun read. The retellings are Bluebeard, Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, Sleeping Beauty and Beauty and the Beast. My favourite short stories in this were the Red Riding Hood ones. I absolutely loved those, and primarily the werewolf. I thought that was probably one of the strongest stories in the collection. I really enjoyed the Bloody Chamber itself, even though I had like a few little issues with just it didn't really add up, but I enjoyed it for what it was. It does have that kind of gothic trope to it, which I really enjoyed because I'm just trash like that. Yeah, I definitely recommend this if you just want something a bit more lighthearted to read. The next short story I'd like to recommend is The Lottery and Other Stories by Shirley Jackson. So I read this a couple of years ago and I kind of struggled with it because there's a lot to this. There's about 26 short stories in this, I believe, and it's just a lot of content. It's a lot of stories to get through, and it can feel a little bit overwhelming at times. And I think I'd only recommend this to people who have read Shirley Jackson previously, who know what her writing style is like, because reading this as your first Shirley Jackson just might be really overwhelming and you might struggle with it. I could see people putting it down and not really picking it back up again. But that being said, there are some really dark short stories in this. The Lottery itself is about a community who do a human sacrifice for the greater good of the community, and it's just really creepy, and there's some stories in this that are just very, very unsettling. So definitely check it out if it's one that you've been meaning to read for a while. The next collection is Haunted Castles by Ray Russell. So I finished this last week. Really enjoyed it. It's a series of gothic short stories, so if you're into reading gothic horror, or if you want to read more gothic horror, or you're curious about it, this would be a really good place to start. The first short story in this really impressed me and it really set up the collection. Ray Russell offers a lot of different writing styles in this as well, so I think it'd be quite easy for someone to differentiate between the stories because they're not really repetitive. Really recommend this if you're into gothic horror. If you want to read something that's kind of spooky as well, check it out. Next, I'd like to recommend Revenge by Yoko Ogawa. I actually don't have my own physical copy of it because I got it from the library at the time, but I did a full review on it, which I will link below. So this short story collection starts out pretty mundane and you don't really feel like there's anything supernatural going on. It starts out with a woman going into a bakery who's buying a cake for her son, but it turns out her son's actually dead and she just buys him his favourite cake every year regardless. So at first, the short stories don't really seem like they're going to be that peculiar, but steadily as you go through each one, you start to realize that not only are they all connected in some way, they proceed to get darker and darker. And my favourite short stories from the collection were Old Mrs. J, Poison Plants, Lab Coats and Sewing for a Heart. I thought they were the best in it. I definitely recommend it if you want to read more translated work or if you want to read more Japanese authors, because it's just such a creative little collection and it's definitely one of my favourites. So the next short story is probably going to be a little bit of an odd one for me to recommend, considering I didn't absolutely love it at the time when I read it, and that is Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Tales by H.P. Lovecraft. So I had an issue with the fact that Lovecraft put in a lot of his own propaganda into the stories, and I had a really hard time separating the stories from that. It just really rubbed me the wrong way. But aside from that, I think that it's important to read where cosmic horror came from, especially if you're someone who's interested in cosmic horror. And though it can seem a little bit repetitive because most of the stories have the same sort of setup, I still think it's an important one to read, especially if you're a horror fan, considering that H.P. Lovecraft went on to inspire just so many people. My favourite short story in this was The Outsider. No surprise that I naturally gravitate towards the gothic short story. I also really enjoyed The Picture in the Hall. That was one about cannibalism, which I just thought was pretty cool. And yeah, so there are some stories in this that really do kind of stick with you if you can get past some of the more iffy things that Lovecraft has to say. And finally, the last short story collection which I'd like to recommend is another one that I read really recently. It's Songs of a Dead Dreamer and Grim Scribe by Thomas Ligotti. So this is all based around the theme of dreams, and because of that, they are some really bizarre, surreal stories in this. And aside from the first short story, which was called The Frolic, which I didn't really enjoy, aside from that one, every other story in this I was unable to predict the ending of. They just twist and turn in such a way that you can't even comprehend how Thomas Ligotti's creativity even works. And that's what I really want from horror stories. I want to be surprised. I want to be taken aback. And there's also some stories that kind of focus on puppets and mannequins, and that freaked me out because I don't really like them. So the story of Dream of a Mannequin really creeped me out. Another short story that was one of my favorites was The Chemist. I just thought that was utterly brilliant. This is like a brilliant short story collection, and I'm glad that I read it. And I assumed that it was going to be really difficult to read, but it wasn't in the end. I got through it, in a week or so. I definitely recommend this for people who want to read out of their comfort zone, who want to read more bizarre horror, or who really like being put on edge and want the anticipation of what's going to happen next. So yeah, really great short story collection. Very, very weird. So those are all the short stories I'd like to recommend. Hopefully you found something in there that's your cup of tea. And let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know if you have any short story recommendations of your own. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.